Welcome to the Why Isn't It Working Business and Tech podcast, talking all things business and tech in the emerging and enterprise space. Here are your hosts, Karl Wood and Michael Hamilton.
Welcome to the podcast. Here today we have Ross Edwards from Ripple, who is a cross-border payments company on blockchain. How are you going today, Ross?
Great, Mike. It's thanks for having me today. It's always good to talk about technology, in particular blockchain and payments, of course.
Well, it's a big thing we love here, Karl?
Always, mate. Always looking for ways to get some money moved around the globe. So, actually, with that, Ross, tell us a bit about Ripple and some of the listeners as well. I mean, it's a very, very interesting area of the market. Michael's obviously big on blockchain himself, but this is something that's really starting to come into the forefront in the commercial world. So, can you tell us a bit more about what your goal is and what you're doing there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Ripple is a cross-border payments company. Was founded in 2012 and started off, very much in the open blockchain space. The founders were from both a fintech and a Bitcoin background. They saw, problems or limitations in Bitcoin and how it could be applied, and could build a similar but different platform that could solve different problems. And based on that, they built out the XRP ledger, which is an open source project and a global public ledger, and have very much been always focused on making payments more efficient. And indeed, the vision of the company, which to be honest has become somewhat cliche, but was quite innovative back then, was the Internet of Value and enabling value to move as easily as information does today on the internet. And very much we see the ability to provide infrastructure that moves value as this sort of third iteration of globalization. Much earlier we saw innovation and standardization in goods and cargo. The standard cargo containers and these sort of pieces. That this wasn't always the case. It was an advent. Then we saw the globalization of information. It wasn't always as easy to get information, whether that's good or bad is up to people to judge on a global scale. It wasn't as easy to get views out there as it has been since the internet. And we see the same thing happening in payments and making it much easier, not just in paying money to your local shop, but indeed in the globalization of money, for consumers. So that's what Ripple's focused on. Off the back of that, we've built out a set of enterprise products. We engage financial institutions and have built a network called, and this potentially isn't a very innovative name, but it's called RippleNet, that consists of licensed financial institutions and provides a next generation infrastructure for making payments easier, cheaper, faster, and indeed building services that couldn't be built before. So that's really Ripple's focus. We're obviously heavily involved in the XRP community, and that also plays a role, the digital asset XRP, and that plays a role in our products as well. In terms of myself, I'm the global head of client solutions. So I lead our pre-sales efforts, working with financial institutions around the world on how they can use RippleNet, how they can use Ripple's products to build services for their customers, what the business case behind that is, and how they would implement Ripple. So we have a team of people who work with as part of our sales team around the world. I lead up that from a capability perspective and work both internally and externally in delivering that to market.
Awesome. Thanks for that. So, I mean, I always try and gauge technology by, when my mum taps me on the shoulder and asks me about something, I kind of know it's hit the mainstream, right? So Bitcoin is one of these things where recently she came and said, what's this all about? What should I get involved in it? And it's the interesting thing I've seen is that we've seen now you can't get a decent graphics card on the market anymore, because they're being hoovered up for Bitcoin mining. We're seeing, multiple exchanges pop up and also have, some pretty catastrophic failures as well. And Michael will probably attest to a few of those. And I think the big thing that we're seeing as a problem though is around, the clearances time. And I noticed with Ripple, you guys are sort of guaranteeing that to be at least like 3 seconds, which is massively quicker than Bitcoin. So what are some of the fundamental differences? And I know you can't go too much into it, but how is that achieved?
Yeah. So in terms of XRP Ledger, it has similarities to Bitcoin and other platforms. Obviously, Ethereum's huge. There are similarities. So it's a autonomous system of record that enables agreed transfer of information and indeed value between parties without a central clearing party, and it does that based on a decentralized peer-to-peer protocol. Where they significantly differ is in that protocol. So Bitcoin famously uses a proof of work mining basis to come to consensus on the state of the data set, because you got to remember Bitcoin is just one big data set. XRP Ledger uses a process called consensus. There are other methodologies. So proof of stake is another one that's quite famous. Now, these work in different ways and they have different properties. And indeed, Bitcoin has some what could be perceived as advantages over XRP Ledger, and XRP Ledger has what can be perceived as advantages over Bitcoin. But it's all relative to what you're trying to achieve. The consensus protocol enables the update of a new ledger, so essentially a new block, in terms of Bitcoin language, every 3 to 5 seconds, and with finality. So this is very important in that after that block is agreed by the consensus protocol across the participating peer-to-peer node network, it cannot be changed. Whereas Bitcoin increases in certainty as additional blocks are added on to the chain. If someone can build a chain longer than that chain, starting at point X, everything after point X gets rewritten. So there is no certainty and finality in Bitcoin. There is in XRP Ledger. And because of the protocol, it can or does create a new ledger every 3 to 5 seconds. And this produces different properties. Obviously, the latency is a massive difference through that. So as opposed to waiting what actually ends up being 60 minutes, because the general approach in Bitcoin transactions is to wait for 6 blocks to be mined until the transfer's certain enough to be definite. You can transfer XRP every 3 to 5 seconds. The throughput is massively different as well. XRP is an account-based state in terms of data. Bitcoin is based on unspent transaction output. The throughput of XRP Ledger has been tested on the production network at thousands of transactions per second, whereas Bitcoin famously has a very heavy restriction, somewhere in the order of up to 7 transactions a second limit, and that produces significant scaling challenges, and certainly a higher focus on what's called layer 2 protocols, off-chain mechanisms. XRP Ledger, of course, consensus is also based on a voting mechanism and doesn't use the power output that Bitcoin uses, and that's seen as a great advantage, and it was a major driver for the founders of the XRP Ledger, or the original developers of the XRP Ledger, to develop it. In terms of other aspects, XRP Ledger in that validation, that consensus mechanism, does require a localized level of trust between the validation nodes. You nominate nodes that you essentially trust. So there is an element of trust in that validation process that there isn't in the mining process. And certainly that's a difference that should be considered. Fundamentally though, XRP Ledger has been built and made hyper efficient for payments. Bitcoin is more of a academic approach, a general purpose approach, and is useful for other things. And obviously, platforms like Ethereum have been more tailored towards a logic machine, a smart contract machine, etc. And there are many other networks out there that are better for different use cases. But we think XRP Ledger, and XRP specifically, is the best digital asset for payments.
That's really interesting. And I guess the big thing we're seeing now is, and what's interesting for the future is, Bitcoin obviously started to come to fruition after the GFC, where people were sort of, disenfranchised with the current economic system, dumping of cash, where cash had no real value when you start to look at it based back to a standard, gold reserve or anything either. We're now coming up to COVID, where governments around the world are, pumping billions into their economy. I think the US has a plan to dump another $2 trillion in over the next few years as well. Do you think that's going to drive more people to alternatives like Bitcoin, Ethereum, like Ripple? I mean, are people going to start to look at that based on, I guess the devaluation of cash as a whole throughout society?
I think that it's definitely going to drive interest and utilization of Bitcoin and XRP and other digital assets. I think there's a question as to how mainstream will that be. Will that be still in niche communities? And the Bitcoin community is huge, but it's still niche on a global scale. Will it be more everyday people? I think that still remains to be seen, but certainly it will drive interest, it will drive use. From Ripple's perspective, we are focused on long-term utility and use of XRP, and we certainly think in the movement of global value that XRP can play a role of a neutral, bridge asset that can bring, different networks and different markets together. And I think that there's great benefit in that. Obviously, internationally stuff, generally will go through US dollar as the de facto standard, but it has a lot of problems with being a sovereign currency and the control that US and US institutions have over that. And we think that XRP can play a role there. So whilst I think there will be an impact at a consumer level, Ripple really positions XRP as a tool for financial institutions, not as a replacement for fiat currency.
And with the actual Ripple itself, does it handle fiat to fiat transfers and fiat to crypto? Is that right?
Yeah, so I mean that is another major difference with the actual technology. Besides XRP, compared to Bitcoin as a currency or a digital asset, the XRP ledger also supports the issuance of liabilities, whether that is, essentially stable coin, a currency. So different decentralized exchanges can issue US dollars, as an example, on XRP ledger, or whether that can be something like gold or something else that can be issued on the XRP ledger and managed on the XRP ledger, and indeed exchanged for other assets on the ledger, whether those are liabilities or whether that's XRP. So it does provide that. In my view, it is a form of, logic and additional structure that can be placed on the network, in the same sort of space as getting to smart contracts. Smart contracts are much more open. That we talk about this Turing complete. This is much more defined in what relationships and structured data can be placed on the network. But it is a very interesting space of XRP ledger, and a major difference certainly to Bitcoin and other networks.
And based on that, it wouldn't be a discussion around Ripple if you didn't ask this question. Are you a competitor to Swift in this case?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I joined Ripple in 2015, so this is in Ripple years, that's quite some time. And I think when I joined, we were more focused on banks and comparing to what can Swift do versus what Ripple can do. There is a long history between the organizations, and indeed, I remember I think it was in 2017 at Cybos in Geneva, which is Swift's conference, and Ripple was attending. And in the middle of the conference, FinExtra published an article about Ripple being the unwanted guest who steals Swift's girlfriend at the party. And that was a very awkward situation. So there's certainly been a lot in terms of media and mindshare. And I like to think that Ripple's been part of a broader fintech effort that has driven innovation from Swift. If you look at GPI, it's really the first fundamental innovation we've seen in Swift in decades, literally. And I think that we've been sort of part of that. But in reality, we think that Swift is built on an antiquated architecture that has been built for very large corporates and has been built for very large correspondents servicing those corporates. It's not built for the future customers of cross-border transactions. And these are individuals. These are small businesses. These are small businesses paying thousands of dollars, maybe even hundreds of dollars to many different suppliers across many different countries, not really large, corporates paying $10 million to two suppliers. So when I meet with many financial institutions, both banks and non-banks, our conversations are not based on how they can do a transaction on Ripple better than they currently do it on Swift. I talk to them about how can they do services that they cannot efficiently deliver to their customers today using their existing infrastructure, predominantly Swift. How can they build a high performance business around these services that scales and maintains agility with the changing customer needs and their changing business strategies, and how can they take advantage of opportunities and challenges in that space? So overall, I think in terms of PR, in terms of different publications and discussions, particularly at the bank level, absolutely, there's some competition with Swift. In terms of mind share, there's some competition with Swift. But in terms of actual implementation and what we're seeing in the market, we don't really see Swift as a competitor in that space.
Because that's fantastic. And also, so you're seeing a speed aspect to your business and a cost reduction for your clients. And so are you looking at the moment, is it more weighted towards business customers or B2B, or is it B2C, or is it just a 50-50 split?
So we work, our customers are licensed financial institutions. So we don't go direct to customer. We don't service merchants, etc., which obviously is a business that needs extreme scale. We work with licensed financial institutions, and we work with them as to how they can service their customers. And RippleNet in particular is focused on high performance businesses built on low value, high velocity payments. And we see predominantly 3 different use cases in particular on the network around that. One is obviously consumer to consumer payments, the majority being OFW remittance transactions, so foreign worker remittance transactions. We work with a lot of banks in India, for instance, which receives billions of dollars a year, majority from Middle East. We work across these corridors. We also work across niche, more lower volume corridors that traditionally have been very expensive and inefficient in that space. It definitely forms probably the majority, the majority of services that we see on the network. There are other types of obviously consumer to consumer payments we see as well, student payments, cross-border bill payments and other aspects. Secondly, we do see a lot of B2B payments on the network. These are predominantly small to medium-sized enterprises paying suppliers in different markets. This is a huge space, and you can see that this is very competitive in the market. If you look at the market in this space, banks lost the market in consumer to consumer payments long ago. If you look at the market in B2B payments, this is where fintech is attacking. If you look at TransferWise's ads these days, it's about the open your business account on TransferWise. We can do your payments overseas. So the small to medium-sized enterprise market is growing massively in every single market that I've been in, which, trust me, is plenty. And the small to medium-sized enterprise of today is obviously the corporate of tomorrow. So it's a very important space for banks and for payment companies. And we have a lot of services and interest in that space. The third one that is, of course, growing and huge as well is platform disbursements. So how does Uber pay their drivers in India? Everything's routed back through Netherlands. It's a very complicated space. And I've spoken to the head of payments in Uber, actually, and he describes their company as more of a payments company than a taxi service. They have hundreds of APIs into different payment services to service this. So if we can bring in consistency in one API that can fulfill that need, then that's a huge use case as well. It would be the smaller of those 3 use cases, but we're seeing a lot of growth and a lot of interest there. And we're looking to bring together a network that can service all 3 of those areas.
So from that perspective, I mean, like you said, you're working with a lot of financial institutions. I mean, are you starting to work a lot more with some of these neobanks that are coming online as well within Australia? I mean, obviously, like you said, the established guys, the big 4, are going to be heavily invested with Swift, and there's usually a bit of a transition across to any new sort of technology. But with the amount of neobanks popping up in Australia, are they like a rich target market for you guys as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And absolutely, we've had conversations with neobanks around the world. It's not just Australia where this is happening. Obviously, the neobank market is much more mature in the UK, as an example. And even the US, we're seeing a lot of innovation in this space. Interestingly enough, we work with many different types of financial institutions. Looking at banks, we work with some of the world's biggest banks. Take Santander for instance, Standard Chartered and others. These are global, truly global banks. We work with regional banks. Some of our services, as an example, Siam Commercial Bank, one of the larger banks in Thailand. Very different profile to those multinational global banks. And we work with some very small niche banks looking to build differentiated services, either enabling their customers to access services based on cross-border payments, servicing, for instance, international student markets and otherwise, or looking to build a transactional business. In terms of the neobanks, they certainly fall into that latter category. And I think one of the interesting discussions we have with neobanks is around what do they need to be successful. The first problem you've got being a neobank, or this is my view at least, in Australia, is how are you going to attract customers? We don't, consumers, if you ask them, probably don't like the big four banks, but they trust the big four banks, right? And it's a very sticky service. So how do you attract new customers? You need to look at different markets. It's much easier to get a new customer than to convince a customer to change from a big four bank to Australia. So who's the new customers? Well, at least until COVID came along, it was sort of immigrants and international students. So I think it's a great space that neobanks can go after, and that's the conversations we've sort of had with them. Having said that, we work with a lot of older, traditional, bigger banks as well. So I think both are in the target market of Ripple. Excuse me.
No worries. And the interesting thing, I guess, like you're talking about, technology which is allowing, fast, secure transactions and standardization. And I mean, this is another thing, like you were saying before, you mentioned Uber. There are a lot of these type of companies now that are basically routing payments across the globe, currency exchanging, all this information, and the complexity in setting that up and maintaining it must be, brutal, so to speak. So, I mean, is that something else that you guys are looking at, providing some simplification around, these sort of, transactions without having to look at different standards for each, country and what, data needs to be sent in each payload and verified? Is that something you think RippleNet's really, really corely designed for?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a major factor, and providing simplification in the technology through standards, through governance is critically important. And this is a huge topic, and honestly is difficult for Ripple as well. Looking at different data in different markets, different regulations in different markets. First and foremost, we want to provide, or we do provide through RippleNet, consistent governance backed up by simple technology to use, one set of APIs for doing all your payment use cases to all your different markets that supports the experience that you want. Real-time, STP-based payments, that facilitates low-value payments and that drives the unit cost of additional payments towards zero, because ultimately that is what will bring about our vision of the Internet of Value as you push that zero transaction cost across the globe. This is an important space. Now, what do we do in that space? We obviously work with financial institutions. Our governance is set up around what's called the RippleNet Committee. That is the financial institutions defining the overall governance, the legal basis, the operating rules for transacting on the network. We also utilize existing standards, because one of the important principles are, we don't need to create new standards where they already exist. So we leverage ISO 20022 in the delivery of payment information to support those payments. And that makes it much easier for banks and payment companies to utilize Ripple in addition to other channels they may have. It is critically important, and it is one of the major factors and value propositions of Ripple is simplification, standardization across the legal basis for transacting, across how do you transact with your parties, what's your rights and obligations on the network, what's the expected actions on the network, and across information and understanding that information. So it's critically important to the success and the value proposition of the network.
That's awesome. That's awesome there. We've more on the technical angle now. Obviously, you've kept it simple. as you said many times there, just keeping it very simple for consumers or for the actual businesses you work with. When you're developing this, the network and all the blockchain interaction, technically, do you have to change your development practices from traditional practices when working with it, or is it the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of blockchain in this space, it does bring about some differences. I think so blockchain, certainly our work in the XRP ledger has been based off of public community as opposed to enterprises. And I think that drives significant difference in development practices and quality control and approach to quality control as well. We've certainly learned a lot about utilizing blockchain and aspects of blockchain within an enterprise solution. And we bring about, we utilize both traditional centralized approaches in addition to blockchain and elements of blockchain. And that has shifted as we go as well. In terms of the deep development and the DevOps and things behind it, we obviously have a dedicated team in that space, and absolutely that is different to, that continues to evolve. It has differences based on the blockchain space, but a lot of its differences as DevOps itself has, significantly changed, certainly in the time that I've been involved in enterprise software, which is quite some time now, towards 20 years, of course. Absolutely, it's different. It's much more community driven and collaboration driven. I think a major aspect also, it's not just the underlying blockchain logic and approaches, but it's also the need for interoperability between systems. Legacy systems were not built to talk to each other. It was sort of added on as an afterthought. Now everything needs to be connected, which creates new dependencies and significantly changes how you develop this software and these systems.
Fantastic. And so to work at Ripple, for example, culture-wise and the skill sets, what do you look for? What sort of people?
Well, you have to be good looking, of course. And
a good haircut.
Just kidding, of course. Look, we have many different people from different backgrounds. I think towards 2/3 of our team are in the engineering space. Transactional systems, financial systems are part of that, but also, getting new practices from different and in particular customer-centric technology spaces in the past, is obviously critical to that. We have people like myself from the more traditional financial services space. My background is in financial services consulting. I worked for Accenture for about 12 years across trading systems, custody banking, and payment systems. I think we also hire people from banks and other financial services. We hire people from legal backgrounds and from regulation backgrounds. The regulatory space is certainly an important aspect of what we do, of course. So I think the right balance across that. Obviously, you've got to be comfortable with discomfort. The solution's always changing. We need to listen to our customers and we need to adapt to that. So, that's essentially the people we're looking for in terms of, culture. It's very inclusive. It's a have a go culture. It's a get out there and solve problems, provide your views. It's not very hierarchical. And I think being able to work dynamically in different teams on different problems is a key skill set to have.
I gotta go, Karl. Sorry, I just took myself off mute.
That's right. I was thinking, I didn't know you were saying or not. So interesting enough. So you've obviously got offices based around the globe, and that kind of works well in with what's going on in regards to the blockchain technology you guys are building. I mean, are there plans? Obviously, you have a roadmap in regards to refining and improving, but is there anything else you guys are working on that using this technology? I mean, one of the big things that people have started talking about is also, stock market, things like shares and those sort of things as well. So is there any plan to sort of divest out from financial payments into other areas of the financial sector as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. Obviously, just locally here, ASX has had a long-term project, I think predominantly with digital asset around blockchain, around the chess system, of course. Certainly there's an application of decentralized technology, be it blockchain or otherwise, in different areas. I think early within Ripple's conception, we had a very broad, back when we were actually Ripple Labs, it was a very lab type approach. We had to go at different areas. We had, a digital identity project. We had a smart contract, project that was called Codius. So this is before the days of Ethereum. But in looking at these different things, we found a couple of different findings at a broad level. One is you can't tackle all problems at once, or even in totally. It's not even healthy for Ripple to solve all problems across these different spaces. We also found, in looking at smart contracts in particular, firstly, a lot of things that are proposed still for smart contracts today don't actually need smart contracts. They don't need autonomous logic. They just need better automation. And we found that the biggest problem we had in developing out automation and autonomous logic was the uncertainty of payments. So based on that, we very much focused on, if we can improve the payment space, other people can utilize that and can build solutions in, whether it's equity market spaces, whether it's other smart, I know smart contracts is a very broad topic, of course, but in that space, if we can provide better certainty and other attributes of payments, then it can be a building block for these different pieces as well. We also, our CEO, Brad Gullinghouse, was very famous pre-Ripple for being a strong supporter of focus, and you need to do something well rather than trying to do lots of things at once. So we are very much focused on payments. We're not really looking at other use cases in terms of stock markets and these sort of pieces, but we are building a payments network, and that means more than just moving money from here to there. Many, many more things, and that's certainly a learning we've had. How to build an ecosystem around that, how to solve challenges in that space. One of the challenges, as an example, is not just how do I move money from here to there, but how do I manage my working capital? And that sort of has produced what we call on-demand liquidity as a solution that enables payments instantly into different corridors without any pre-funding. And we've now built on top of that a line of credit offering so that you can make payments now and they can be funded at a later point in time. And these are new product offerings that we've brought, not to just solve payments, but to solve building a high performance payments business. So I think that that's really where our focus is. Certainly, we're very interested in how our customers can utilize RippleNet as a platform as part of broader end-to-end business processes, be it stock markets or other spaces.
I noticed I was looking at the Libra hearings last year, and I have to ask this question. It's more VC based, obviously, but I saw your CEO in the media a lot talking about educating some politicians actually on blockchain in general. I noticed. Yep. Then later on in 2019, the $200 million of funding round you had there, which is awesome. It was the biggest of the year in blockchain. Does that make you guys the biggest now in blockchain in theory? Or
well, I don't necessarily run the book on or the table. Ripple is certainly has a strong presence within the blockchain space. Has been one of the earliest companies focused on use of blockchain for enterprises. 2012 was when the company was founded, was a very early stage of that. In terms of the funding and size, though, for us, we look at the size of the challenge, and solving for cross-border payments across the world. Trillions of dollars locked up in these cross-border payments. It's a huge undertaking, and doing that globally requires a lot of resources. So it really provides us the opportunity to build the company we need. Part of that is, opening the office here in Sydney in 2015, but we're now located in over 10 offices around the world. And we've contracted in over, I think it's 55 countries in the world with different financial institutions. To do that at scale, to be in front of customers, to listen to customers, not just create a technology and publish it and say it's great, but to actually go into different customers around the world, that requires significant infrastructure, and the size of Ripple and our fortunate position in that funding enables that. So that's really what we focus on, the opportunity to make a difference on such a huge scale problem in terms of global payments.
And obviously around from last year with Libra coming out, it's really started to educate some mainstream people and businesses and so forth. And the good thing was Ripple was in a good position before Libra was announced, honestly. So how does the Libra announcement, and obviously it's been watered down since, what's your thoughts on Libra and where it's gone and, you know, impacting Ripple potentially? If not, I don't have to answer that, of course. But.
Well, look, I mean, Libra was obviously a huge announcement and an event, you know, within the blockchain and indeed the payments and indeed the money space. The original announcement was it's going to be a fiat currency replacement. And that obviously had a huge impact on regulators. And we've seen a massive, and I think a unexpectedly massive backlash from regulators, at least for Libra and Facebook, which has been interesting. Yeah, Ripple's approach has always been very different. Ripple's approach has been, how can we build infrastructure that supports sovereign or fiat currencies and the existing markets and institutions within that? In terms of impacts, you know, we definitely saw a lot of reaction from the market in the payment space. A lot of people saw the announcement of Libra as a threat. They saw the opportunity to engage platforms like Ripple. We have had a lot of interest from institutions that are driving off, how do I make my business more scalable, more agile, and be able to compete against threats such as Libra proposes. I think Libra has also brought about or been part of some positives. And one of those positives is a focus on the end user. Traditionally, payments, banking, and money have been about, you know, the focus has been on financial institutions. And I think the market has largely ignored last mile connectivity and the actual end customers. And yeah, they've realized, not just through Libra, but many other things, that was a huge mistake. We've seen the advent of things such as digital wallets and more, you know, customer experience and customer focused spaces. And the focus has moved away from the financial institutions and more to the end users. And that has been a good thing. And I think Libra has been about that. Why is Libra such a threat? Because they have such a huge end customer set, 2 billion people or whatever the users of Facebook are. And we've seen that in financial institutions as well, that they're not just thinking about how they can operate better, but how they can provide services their customers are asking for. So I think that's been a positive to come out of it. It's certainly going to be interesting to see how it progresses from here. The regulatory backlash has been, really interesting. And how Libra adapts, how Facebook adapts, and how regulators adapts will be certainly interesting in the coming years.
That's fantastic. But also, you just mentioned the regulation there. So Ripple working with regulators helps grow the business, obviously. It also helps the ecosystem that is blockchain. But at the end of the day, it's not about the technology. It's about the outcome for the consumer and business consumers also. Are you guys working closely with regulators? Obviously, I noticed Bank of America was on your one of your boards there, help there. And
we do work with regulators around the world. I've stopped counting, but we did have a counting list of how many central banks and key regulators we've met around the world. And there've been plenty. We at times educate them. For most of our services, Ripple is a non-regulated entity. We're a network and technology provider. We educate them about that. We educate them about our solutions. Some of the questions are, how are they safe? How are they secure? Some of the questions are, how does this improve our regulated institutions' ability to service customers' needs? So we do a lot of education around that space. We do a lot of engagement with central banks and regulators with our customers to get approval for different services as well. I've been to many of the institutions around, in particular, Asia and the Middle East, and South Asia, which is where I've worked. We've had services approved in places such as working with the Central Bank of Bangladesh, as an example, how we can build services into the country, how we can align, or help the regulated financial institutions align to the regulations there, and how we can better enable them to meet the regulators' objectives. So regulator engagement is obviously a huge part of our business, and has been for many years and in many different countries, of course.
Area as well, I guess, is like we mentioned before, you have established players in the market who effectively have a lot to lose, from, companies such as yourself, things like Libra, things like Bitcoin. So do you think there is a resistance, that's and a bit of fear mongering that goes on whenever new technology comes along that can offer solutions because established players, don't quite have the jump on other companies, so to speak?
I think there's a dynamic there, and this is probably all sort of markets and all technologies in different spaces. You get different reactions out of different players. Some of them see it as an opportunity to improve themselves. Some of it see it as a threat, as competition. And, I guess my role is about pushing financial institutions more to the former and seeing that as an opportunity and how they can utilize it. Some of those big players we work closely with. We work closely, as an example, with MoneyGram, one of the largest money transmitters in the world. I think it's potentially second behind Western Union. So some of them are embracing it and seeing it solving many of their challenges. Some do see it as a potential threat. But even if it is seen as a threat and pushes institutions, certainly the incumbents, to build more innovative services, I certainly see that as a positive as well, and bringing positive outcomes to the consumers.
Awesome. Sorry, Michael, please go ahead. I don't want to interrupt.
No, you go. No, it's all you, mate. Go ahead.
That's all right. From a personal perspective, obviously we've been talking a bit, about, technology using blockchain. From an investment standpoint, do you think there is now more of an alternative market starting to open up in this area than we've seen before? Like traditionally, it's usually, high net worth individuals might have property, mixed investments, and they've got maybe, like we mentioned with a couple of the guys we had on here before, there is that area of, some high risk, high reward investments. And I think looking at it now, that's starting to really open up and be more accessible to everyone. But again, I think the problem that I've seen is we don't have a centralized place for the education. And I think, Michael, you probably agree with this, the education and understanding of, non-fiat based currency and how it can have a positive impact. So do you think there should be more of an open source way of looking at this and creating a larger community that combines these things? I mean, just for example, Ethereum kind of span off from people who are dissatisfied with Bitcoin. And if you talk to one or the other, you're not going to get any sort of happiness between them. So, I mean, is it up to us to kind of bring people together and say, hey, look, there's a common goal behind all of this, which is, better payments, more transparency, less manipulation of currency, is that kind of lacking in the market, you think?
Oh, I think there's always going to be a sort of knowledge gap, and there's going to be a space to fill that. There is a lot of information out there. In some ways, there's too much information out there, which makes it also hard to learn in this space. I think the first thing to understand is that, that's really important to understand in assessing the sort of market and an understanding of it is these digital assets, these networks, these technologies are substantially different, right? Blockchain is somewhat analogous and actually is a database, right? And it's like saying, do you have to understand database to understand? Different applications sitting on databases work in different ways and do different things. And that's the case for the different digital assets and networks that exist today. We obviously have been a key part of building XRP Ledger, specifically tuned to payments problems. Ethereum has different attributes and different ways that it works and different use cases that it's used for. Bitcoin has a different one and the other one. So you need to understand all these different digital assets are different. I think there needs to be some level of understanding of the technology, but there needs to be a broader understanding of the markets, what the utility of these different assets are. It is a formidable space from the outside, but it's very interesting, and I think it's certainly going to be very relevant to the future. So the opportunity is there, and I think when I joined Ripple, which was in 2015 to now, there is a much better, broader understanding in the community around both the technology and the digital asset markets themselves as well. And also, so hopefully that continues.
Oh, definitely, for sure. Because you have a bit of a global perspective on things and obviously living in Sydney, how do you feel Australia sits now with adoption? not just blockchain, but a bit more of innovation. And then obviously the US and Asia and Europe, for example. Where do you think Australia sits at the moment?
Interesting question. I think, in looking at the digital asset space, Australia has taken good, strong steps. I think one of the major things is the licensing regime by AUSTRAC for digital exchanges is, very progressive and provides, a great market. And that's one of the reasons that Australia is one of the limited markets that we have our on-demand liquidity, solution available. It requires a level of certainty within the market, which the regulatory setting, and in particular that licensing of digital exchanges provides. In terms of, different markets will have different positions on cryptocurrency or digital assets. We've recently been very clear that we see a lot of problems in the uncertainty within the US regulatory space. Not so much the rules are onerous. The problem is the rules are unknown. And, there are publications we've seen in the US recently that name 7 different regulators, all of which have different views of what a digital asset is and how it should be regulated. And that's not an environment that is good for business. It's not about having softer regulations, it's just having consistent and clear regulations. Whereas, some other spaces like UK, some of the countries in Asia are much clearer. In terms of more broadly in financial services, my view is that Australia has a very conservative financial services sector, let's just say, more conservative than most of the other markets we work in. And we work in cross-border payments. One of the challenges we have in Australia is cross-border payments are a small part of the certainly banking and even non-banking space. That domestic services are much more prevalent. I talk to a bank in Australia about cross-border services, and it might be, 5 to 10% of their revenue. I talk to a bank in Philippines, and it's probably 60% of their revenue. So obviously, there's a lot more propensity to innovate in that space and to build new services in that space in Philippines versus Australia. So that's kind of natural.
Okay, so Asia's really somewhere you see.
Asia, definitely. Asia's definitely hot in this space. It has a huge dependent on cross-border and cross-currency movement of money between the countries there. But we see many other spaces here. We have a lot of services, and we see a lot of activity in South America as another example, and LATAM as a whole. Middle East has been very strong for us, as well as the subcontinent. We're seeing growth and interest and a need in pretty much all parts of the world, which is understandable in cross-border payments. But in these areas in particular, we think our message and value proposition particularly resonates.
Right. Fantastic. So what does the future look like for Ripple, and obviously blockchain and innovation that way? So where do you think you're going to go? All happening, further growth?
Yeah, obviously we want to continue to build, the RippleNet as a network. A lot of that is bringing on, new members onto the network, providing, building new services on that network, growing the transaction volume on that network is a key undertaking for us. And part of it's also building on new value within that network. So I talked before about the adding on-demand liquidity, opening up new corridors in the on-demand liquidity space. And of course, now our line of credit offering and ensuring that that's available to institutions that need it and can use it to solve working capital challenges. So it's about building the network. It's about continuing to work with members of the network to build the overall quality, because it's not just about technology or even the governance structures, but it's about the participants and their capabilities as well. So I think that's where our focus certainly will be, in continuing to deliver value, not just to the financial institutions on the network, but in particular their customers, and hopefully moving towards that Internet of Value vision eventually. And I think we've made significant progress towards that, but it's a very big, as I said, undertaking, and luckily we have the resources and opportunity to tackle it.
Wonderful. Well, Ross, I just want to thank you on behalf of myself and Michael for joining us today. It's been really, really interesting listening to what Ripple's currently working on, the future of payments, and it's wonderful to see success. I mean, you guys are present over 40 companies, you've got over 500 employees. So, I mean, it's obviously quite a large movement and people are starting to really jump on board. You do have some large financial institutions that are also buying into this. So obviously people are seeing the value, and obviously myself and Michael, who are really interested in, the technical side of, the payments and the Bitcoin scenario that's ongoing as well. We're going to obviously be watching this space very tight. So we'll definitely have to have you back on the show again soon.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both for the time. And it's always good to talk about these topics. And in terms of Ripple, it's certainly been an exciting 5 years to date. And Ripple has changed, the market has changed, and I'm sure that will continue into the future. So I'm certainly looking forward to seeing the future challenges and opportunities that we can tackle as well.
Awesome. All the best. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Bye.